We celebrate Transfiguration Sunday every year on the Sunday before Ash Wednesday, and Ash Wednesday starts Lent. We do it every year. It's not a big Sunday that people look forward to. I don't think any of you got up and said, "Boy, I can't wait to go to Transfiguration Sunday, hear a Transfiguration sermon." There were no Sunday supplements in the paper this morning, for sales for Transfiguration Sunday. And it's a hard one to get your head around. I mean, holidays like Christmas and Easter, you can kind of get your head around. And other miracles, we might not know how they happened, but we know why they happened. I mean, the miracle of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, we might not know how he did it, but we know why he did it. He loved his friend Lazarus. When he heals the sick and feeds the hungry, we might not know how he fed the 5,000, but we know why he fed the 5,000. He looked upon them and had compassion on them. But this is hard. Transfiguration is hard. I mean, what's the point? What's the purpose? What do we learn about God from Jesus becoming radiant and whiter than any earthly bleach could make him, and so on? What's the point of that? You can't separate Transfiguration from what happened 6 days before. And in the scripture that Sherry told begins with 6 days later. Well, what happened 6 days before? It was what's known as Peter's confession on the road to Caesarea Philippi. Jesus asked the disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And, they say one of the prophets, or John the Baptist, and he says, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus says, "You got it, you nailed it, you're right, that's who I am, the Son of the living God." And then he predicts that he will go up to Jerusalem and be betrayed, deserted, brought to trial, tortured, executed, and on the third day rise from the dead. And Peter says, "God forbid that should ever happen to you." Can't imagine it happening to Jesus. So that's what went on 6 days before the Transfiguration. And I figure in those 6 days, the disciples are wondering, what's this stuff about Jesus being tortured and betrayed and deserted and killed? I mean, they must have started to have second doubts and second thoughts on following Jesus. Are we backing the wrong horse here? They might have been losing confidence in Jesus. And Jesus might have had his doubts and his second thoughts. And is this really what I want to do? Do I really want to go up to Jerusalem and be crucified? Is that really what I want? And so when he goes up to the mountain to pray, I picture this person and his disciples who are fearful. And they have this vision where God descends and Jesus is filled with God's power and God's radiance, and he shines. And he talks with the two pillars of Judaism, Moses the lawgiver and Elijah the prophet. Now that's got to bolster his confidence. He's got to feel encouraged and strengthened and, encouraged enough to keep going. Yep, I'm on the right path. And that's got to make the disciples feel pretty good. What are the disciples doing during all this time? What are Peter, James, and John doing? Well, they're watching it. They're watching it. They're kind of passive observers of what Jesus is doing in the cloud and his whiteness and the vision of Moses and Elijah. They're just observing it. It's kind of like they're watching a movie. They're just spectators. There's the movie and here they are, but they're not in it. And that's fine, it's entertaining. It's good stuff. I mean, we like watching movies. We like watching movies in the safety of our living room. We like watching movies in the dark theater. And, what goes on the screen might be entertaining. It might capture us, but There's a difference between what's going on the screen and what's going on in our life. Then this voice comes from the cloud. This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Same thing the voice said at Jesus' baptism. It's great. Jesus, you're God's Son. That's great stuff. Good for you, Jesus. And then the voice adds this little phrase. Listen to him. And it changes everything. They fall down in fear. They're terrified. They're paralyzed. Just that voice saying, listen to him. Because now the movie that's on the screen has jumped off the screen into their life. They're no longer observers. They are involved in what's going on. They have a stake in this. God has come into their life, and they're involved in God's story. And it changes everything, and it is terrifying. I mean, think of watching a movie. Now, what I was thinking of was the last episode of season 6 of Game of Thrones. Any of you seen it? Oh, come on, one of you's seen it. Okay, thank you. Thank you. It was gripping. It was gripping. I was enjoying watching it with a bowl of peanuts on my lap. And you know, on my easy chair, and oh my gosh, that battle at the end where Jon Snow and the forces of goodness had united, and they were being overwhelmed by that evil, Ramsay Bolton. Oh gosh, you know, and they were just being overwhelmed, and the bodies were piling up, and more of the forces of good were being killed, and Jon Snow got overwhelmed, and he was smothering. The bodies were coming on top of him, and he couldn't breathe, and he had to struggle out. And I thought, oh my God, we're going to lose this. We're going to lose this, and evil is going to triumph. And I thought, what would happen if I got drawn into that battle scene and I was right next to Jon Snow? It would be terrifying. I would lose my peanuts. It would be awful. If they jumped off the screen and came into our living room, I would be terrified. I wouldn't be a passive spectator. I would be an actor, and I wouldn't know what was going to happen. I think that's what happened to the disciples. It jumped off the screen, and they were terrified. Of course they were terrified. I mean, if God appears in your living room, the all-great, powerful God who created the worlds and parted the oceans and causes earthquake and thunder and lightning, that's scary stuff. What's going to happen to me? Will I be smothered in the battle? Will I make it? Will Sansa come with the Salvation Army to save me from the evil Ramsay Bolton? It's scary stuff. What's going to happen? I think this is what's happening to the disciples. They're terrified that God has broken into their life, and they don't know what's going to happen. This story of the Transfiguration follows an outline that is fairly common in miracle stories in the New Testament. And the outline is normal life. The divine breaks into the normal life. People are afraid. And then the divine says, fear not. It happens with Mary. When the angel appears, she's going about her business. The angel appears and says, God's going to enter your life. And she is troubled. And the angel says, fear not. It happens with the shepherds. I mean, you see them afraid there. When they're minding their own business, keeping watch over their flocks by night, and the angels appear to say that Jesus has been born, the break-in, and they're terrified. And the angel says, fear not. At the resurrection, the women going about the routine of taking spices to anoint the corpse, and the angel breaks in, and they're terrified. And the angel says, "Fear not. It's common." We're scared of break-ins. Break-ins tend to diminish us. We want to put up our defenses and prevent them. There was a break-in 2 doors down from us on King Avenue. When I heard about it, I didn't like it. I became fearful. I wanted somebody to say to me, "Fear not." The disciples are afraid. Of course they're afraid. We're afraid of what a break-in will do to us. It will change us. Now, with the Bible stories, every time there's a break-in of the divine, it's the divine wanting to bring new life. And we use different phrases for that. Reborn, new creation, born again, resurrection, transformation. But it's still scary to have new life, because new life is always preceded by the death of the old life. And new life is always going a little bit into the unknown. When a couple gets married, they're going from their old life of singlehood, where they didn't have to think about anybody but themselves, to a new life of thinking about the other person and being with the other person. And that can be scary, because the old life has to die. When a couple has a child, it's an end to the old life of a lot of freedom, to a new life of responsibility, and pampers and diapers and loading up the car for a trip. It's a change, and it can be fearsome. New life always implies the death of the old, and often we just put off the new life as much as we can. So the disciples are afraid. And then in verse 7, it says, Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up, do not be afraid." There they are in the fetal position, and Jesus comes and touches them, saying, "Get up, do not be afraid." Can you picture that? I mean, we have all this grand and glorious stuff, and then we have this very human coming, touching, "Get up, do not be afraid." 2 weeks ago I said that Hillel summed up the law of the Old Testament while standing on one foot. Did any of you try that? So the gospel can be summed up with verse 7, standing on one foot. Jesus came, touched them, saying, "Get up, do not be afraid." That's the whole gospel, isn't it? That's what Jesus did throughout his gospel. He came to people, he touched them, "Get up, do not be afraid." He came to the dying person. He came to the sick person. He came to the hungry person. He came to the lonely person. He came to the outcast and said, "Get up, do not be afraid. I'm offering you new life. I'm offering you transformed life, where your life will shine also with the power of life within you." You can think of times in your life when you were afraid, where you had a diagnosis and were facing surgery, and somebody came to you and touched you, held your hand, and said, "Get up. Don't be afraid." You can think of times where you didn't know what was going to happen next. You'd lost your job. You'd broken up with your partner. And somebody came to you and touched you and said, "Get up. Do not be afraid." That was Jesus coming to you. Our witnesses that we do so often are essentially following that outline, where the person giving the witness is talking about how they felt alone or isolated. Somebody in the church or this church came to them and touched them and said, "Get up. Do not be afraid." That was the outline of Felicia's witness today. Felicia, she came here. And she was touched by our congregation that said to her, "Get up. Do not be afraid. Enter the new life, the transfigured life. Be reborn as your authentic person." We were Jesus. We are Jesus. Touching and saying to people, "Get up and do not be afraid." I don't know what Felicia's face looked like when she gave her witness, but I watched your faces. And so many of your faces were transfigured. So many of your faces became radiant and glowed. That was the power of life glowing in you. That's transfiguration. It happens a lot. Jesus says to his disciples at the end of this story, as they have gotten up and not been afraid, "Don't tell anybody about this." I think there are two reasons Jesus says that. The first is, who's going to believe it? Who's going to believe when they come down and they say, "Hey, we had this vision where Jesus became radiant and we saw Moses and Elijah and we heard this voice"? Who's going to believe that? Go to Broad and High and tell somebody that. Who's going to believe that? I think the other reason Jesus said, "Don't tell anybody about it," is he didn't want anybody to talk about it. He wanted people to do it. He wanted disciples who would come down the mountain with him and do what he did. He wanted disciples who would go to people and touch them and say, "Get up. Do not be afraid. There's new life." We have those opportunities, don't we? To go to people. We have those opportunities, it seems, more and more. Because you think of what's the opposite of saying that. The opposite of doing that verse is to not go to people, to avoid them. That's how our society's going, isn't it? To avoid people. It's not touching people. It's not talking to people and saying, "Get up, don't be afraid." It seems so simple, but it is really extraordinary. It's miraculous. We can all think of someone that we will meet in the next week that we can go to and touch and say, "Get up, do not be afraid. There is new life. There is resurrection." Jesus shined. The disciples did. And we do too. When Jesus touches us and says, "Get up, do not be afraid." And when we touch others and say, "Get up, do not be afraid." May it be so. Amen.